The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to our webinar on Is the mining industry doing enough to implement ESG at the ground level? I'm Andrew Fake, Global Head of Content for Mines and Money. A couple of housekeeping comments before we start. The webinar is scheduled to run for 1 hour. All registrants will receive a copy of the recording of this webinar via email. You can ask questions at any time by using the questions tab on the GoToWebinar panel on your screen. And if you experience any trouble with sound, we recommend that you exit the webinar and then log back in again. For today's webinar, we are joined by Adam Mathews, who is a Director of Ethics and Engagement for the Church of England Pensions Board, as well as co-chair of the Transition Pathway Initiative and a board member of the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change. Following the Brumadinho tailings dam disaster, Adam is co-lead of the Mining and Tailings Safety Initiative with John Houchin from the Swedish Ethics Council. Matt Fifield is the managing partner of Pacific Road Capital, which manages 2 institutional private equity funds with total commitments of 800 million. Pacific Road is an industry leader in responsible investment and a signatory to the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. Alexander Shea currently serves as the Director of Corporate Research for the Emerging Markets Investors Alliance, of which one of its key goals is to promote a wider awareness of ESG issues. Dr. Elaine Dorward-King was elected as Executive Vice President of Sustainability and External Relations for Newmont in March 2013. Dr. Elaine Dorward-King brings 25 years of leadership experience in creating and implementing sustainable development, safety, health and environmental strategy and programs in the mining, chemical and engineering consulting sectors. And Adam Davey is Chief Operating Officer of ICMM. And as Chief Operating Officer, he is responsible for strategy development and implementation, integrating communications into all of ICMM's work, and the allocation of staff resources and staff development. He also leads ICMM's work on environmental issues, including the management of tailings. Welcome to our 5 webinar guests. So without further ado, I'd like to go and dive deep into the issue of why ESG is important. So perhaps I can turn to Adam Mathews first. From your perspective, Adam, how important are ESG factors in your decision to invest in or remain invested in mining companies?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to join the panel. From the perspective of the Church of England Pensions Board, ESG criteria are extremely important. We view mining as an extremely significant sector. It's intimately connected with modern society, how we live. Many of the resources required to support the low carbon transition and modern living require this sector. However, when you look at it, it presents a lot of concerns from an ESG perspective as well as an ethical perspective. Often the issues are common across many sectors, but are in extremis when faced with the mining sector. We profile companies individually as well as a sector collectively on ESG grounds. We also add additional ethical considerations as an ethical investor as well. And for us, they're absolutely intrinsic in our assessments of companies. We've noted that there's quite a divergence in practice across the sector. There are some very good operators at the sort of high end of the ESG spectrum, but equally there are others at the other end. And as a sector, it's particularly challenged when you have issues such as tailings dams, disasters as you've recently had at Brumadinho, which really challenge, I think, responsible investors in the sector that ultimately want it to succeed. And lastly, I'd add other criteria such as climate change, which clearly is an ESG issue. That's of enormous significance to us, and how companies approach that, putting in place strategies to manage the transition is critical to how we view our ability to maintain our investments in them.
Thank you very much for that, Adam. Aidan, ICMM represents the world's leading mining companies. Has ESG moved towards the top of their in-tray, and is there any consensus on what is important?
Thanks, Andrew. And look, arguably, ESG issues have been top of our members' in-tray since we were formed back in the early 2000s. Our member CEOs adopted 10 principles for sustainable development back in 2003, and that's really guided the work of ICMM in the intervening period. And so while we didn't use the term ESG in those days, the principles cover just that: environmental stewardship, social responsibility, governance and ethical business practices. So I guess on the question of, is there an emerging consensus on what's important? I think there is. Last year, our members agreed to adopt a comprehensive set of 38 performance expectations. And these are grouped under our 10 principles. And through the performance expectations, we look to establish a comprehensive set of performance requirements on a diverse set of environmental, social, and governance issues that society cares deeply about. And so I would argue that for investors and other stakeholders interested in confirming that the materials, which are so essential to modern living, are mined responsibly, our performance expectations set a benchmark for responsible mining.
Mm-hmm. Elaine, Newmont has been at the forefront of ESG. What has Newmont been specifically doing at implementing ESG policy, both at the immediate operational level and also as part of your longer term risk management strategy?
Thank you, Andrew, and it's good to be here on the webinar this morning, this afternoon, this evening. Newmont Goldcorp has an overarching policy that's set by the board. We call that our Sustainability and Stakeholder Engagement Policy, that describes the commitments that we have made and the promises we intend to keep across the ESG space. To deliver on those commitments, we have what I call an implementation framework. One aspect of that framework are strategies that describe how we're going to address longer term risks, things such as water, access, impact, stewardship, climate change and our response to that, and other issues such as artisanal and small scale mining, just to give some examples. We set these global strategies that are then implemented in our regions and at our operations. And often that implementation is over a period of time and has targets associated with it. More tactically, at the operations level, we have global performance standards that we also apply globally, are implemented every operation, and that are minimum performance expectations, which are often more than what might be required. And our standards are very much aligned to the ICMM performance expectations that Aidan just mentioned. The key thing to mention also with regard to implementation on the ground is that these standards and strategies can't be owned by the corporate center. They have to be part of what our leadership sees as essential to the business, and that all of our operators understand that they're important to our business success.
Okay. So just kind of like leading on from that, so Matt, the 30 largest mining companies seem to be getting ESG, but what about the 300 next largest mining companies?
Yeah, Andrew, that's a great question. Just to give you a little bit of context, at Pacific Road, we invest predominantly into single asset producers, emerging producers, construction stage, and sometimes, although less frequently, development stage assets. And so these companies are some of the areas of biggest impact. It's actually one of the most exciting parts of the conversation that we're having. We find, no surprise, that the level of sophistication, thought, and focus and management buy-in increases as maturity and complexity of operations increase. So large multi-asset companies do a pretty good job. They have relatively sophisticated programs. Everybody's looking to be better and perform against more transparent benchmarks. And then as you go down, the urgency and pressure on management tends to increase, and you're worried about at the very junior end, how am I going to keep the lights on and keep my project moving forward, or how am I going to get through the permitting process, or is everybody going to show up on time for construction? Are we going to have overruns? Or now that I have one asset, wow, now I have two assets. How do I set up my management from there? So a lot of the focus is really around operational issues. And I guess as a to set that standard, there, in general, we feel like people are highly focused on attaining social license through environmental performance as dictated by regulators and standards of performance. Where we are focused is creating a more transparent dialogue, particularly in change situations and development situations, showing and emphasizing a lot of the work in the S that actually builds more robust businesses that ultimately, as investors, those businesses can attract capital, get access to lands quicker, get more social license, more buy-in. And so that series of programs is really designed, it's part of its business resiliency and risk mitigation, and part of it's actually more opportunity facing across a wide spectrum. So, the brief answer is the focus scales down, but leadership comes from capital. And what we are trying to do, as a number of people on this call are looking to do, is what we're doing with our portfolio companies is making that front and foremost in the boardroom and around the allocation of our capital, spending more time thinking through these issues and trying to achieve outcomes.
So turning over to Alex. Alex, can you tell us a little bit about your organization and the work it's been doing to promote a wider awareness of ESG issues?
Thanks, Andrew. Sure. The Emerging Markets Investors Alliance it's a coalition of developing market institutional investors. So it's PMs, analysts, traders, salespeople, all involved in EM and FM markets. So we work with institutions investing in public market securities. So that's going to be across sovereign, corporate fixed income, and equities. The Alliance itself is a nonprofit, and its mission is to educate and advocate on sustainability issues in EM. So our theory of change really involves educating investors who in turn then are going to address ESG concerns with their portfolio companies and governments. We also do a fair amount of direct advocacy with companies. We have a couple segments. So one is essentially a think tank on EM ESG, and it's really the only dedicated organization that I'm aware of focused not only on conducting original research, which we do, but also aggregating relevant research on ESG and EM from our sell side and independent research members. And in that vein, we kind of frequently hold conferences. So the last two were in New York and London. They're with BlackRock and BNP. And where during those conferences, we basically highlight ESG integration strategies that either mitigate risk or where you can gain greater insight into investments. And we have a number of working groups, one on the extractives industry, the majority of the initiatives around mining and oil and gas, and another on fiscal transparency. And I'd say one last thing, one thing unique about our model is that we combine policy expert community with investors. So for instance, we do a lot of work with the World Bank, with the IFC, Oxfam, NRGI, and put people in the same room that don't normally have the opportunity to talk with each other. So our working group co-chairs are investors, but the policy folks do a lot of educating on the relevant ESG issues. Andrew, can I say just a quick word on the importance of ESG factors? The question addressed to Adam. Great. Yeah, I just wanted to simply add for the corporate protocol, because this is a part of the work that we do, kind of irrespective of the positive kind of normative benefits. We also focus a lot on the ESG factors and the correlates with security performance. So one very interesting thing that we found in the realm of mining and equities across a bunch of dimensions. So resource intensity, waste and emissions, employee engagement, diversity, workforce safety, lots of sub-metrics within those categories. Actually, the top correlates with equity outperformance over a 5-year period ended up being waste recycling, water recycling, and renewable energy use. Actually, renewable energy use, which was tied with, in terms of annual percentage gains with employee turnover, which is a more traditional metric. But that's pretty amazing. I think what often happens is that these metrics give additional insight into the quality of management under the theory that, managers that are thinking hard about the stewardship of resources are probably doing a lot of other things well, but it's interesting nevertheless.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think that this leads very, very neatly onto our first poll of this webinar. And the question is the mining industry doing enough to implement ESG at the ground level? You should see a choice of 3 options coming up now, either yes, no, or unsure. And you can vote on the polling button. So if you'd like to go and poll as to which of those 3 answers you most agree with. Whilst we're just doing that, perhaps I can ask Alex, what's your view? Is the mining industry doing enough to implement is the mining industry doing enough to implement ESG at the ground level?
Okay, so yeah, I guess my short answer is no, but that's a biased view from a do-gooder advocacy organization. So maybe I'll sidestep a bit, and rather than focus on what the mining industry should be doing, maybe I'll just make a couple observations of where we see things moving based on our membership. And these are things that I think are ultimately going to force management's hand a bit if they aren't already thinking about them or implementing some changes. So I wrote down a couple areas that are moving pretty quickly here. So one, with respect to social license risk, obviously social media has really transformed everything. So the ability to organize a significant number of people, especially in EM, since many of the markets have bypassed traditional wireline technology and wireless is ubiquitous, that's kind of made for much less tolerance of controversy, and I think forced more pressure on regulators to act in terms of suspending or revoking permits to operate. You know, MSCI, and we've worked with Sam Block over there, has aggregated the number of mining work stoppages instances globally due to some kind of organized opposition of some kind. And it's really very high. It's so high, in fact, that we're currently trying to examine whether investors are being adequately compensated for those risks. Let's see, 2, we're going to get into this in a little greater detail later, but the investment climate is definitely changing. There's kind of a continuum. At one end, there are investors that really don't care and are simply analyzing the best return prospects. But even at that end, the fiduciary pressures are growing. If you're a PRI signatory, as a firm, and those numbers are now in the thousands, I think with every major financial institution on board at this point, you've made a series of pledges to incorporate ESG considerations into your investments, right? And now, there's no teeth to this beyond annual reviews of progress and the like, but clients are beginning to ask, and I'd say even the most reluctant investors are saying, okay, to win this pension fund business, we need to at least score our portfolio across a bunch of ESG dimensions. So we have an answer when they ask. Of course, at the other end of the continuum are really progressive firms that feel like some of these new metrics are helping them glean insights into their investments that they didn't have previously. Let me quickly here. 3, obviously managing extreme weather is becoming more difficult. So the industry is obviously facing increasing loss, physical risks through drought and flood becoming more frequent. We have a fierce competition for water supplies. So you have increasing demand, you have declining ore grades, more ore is being processed, which means more water. So, you combine that with dam failures being foremost in people's, rising remediation costs for governments. That probably means more guarantees and upfront financing that's going to be required for approval. So CapEx and OpEx are changing the economics of some of these projects. And so all the water-related mining risks taken together, the physical, the social, reputational, and the regulatory are on the rise, and this is likely to continue. And let me cut myself off here. I just say for transparency. We're obviously living in an environment which, transparency in general is increasing, and there are less places to hide today. So, if you ask the question, are companies really disclosing, the nature of their relationships with governments? Are they providing adequate disclosure regarding their environmental liabilities? How effective are the health and safety measures that are being implemented? More and more eyes are focused on every aspect of those questions, and that's going to continue in our view.
Thank you very much. I think we can now have the results of the first poll up. So in answer to, is the mining industry doing enough to implement ESG at the ground level? 5% of you said yes, 58% of you said no, and 37% of you were unsure. Which leads into the next section of our webinar, which is how the mining industry is responding. So firstly, Matt, what are the material risks and opportunities that ESG issues present for the mining industry?
Well, truly, Alexander did a great job of outlining a lot of the core focus areas and risks. It would be hard to go through that and start to pick out more areas that you can focus on. But so let me for a second, I think, perhaps pivot towards the opportunity side. On the risk side, you have loss of social license, you have work stoppages, you have the type of people that you're attracting to work in your business and their connection with with their job and the communities around you, and there's a whole bunch of material risks there. On the same different side of the same coin is that done correctly through transparent and upfront engagement and respect and acknowledgement of people that are in the process, you can actually, I think, build a culture that not only attracts people but engages in, say, the permitting, development, and operational process in a way that that delivers outperformance. We're seeing that across our portfolio. Just to give you a brief example, some people they go off into the work shed and they develop a permit and they come out at their open house and say, "Ta-da! Here's our permit. Let's talk about it." And then there's a lot of consternation because people weren't really involved as much in the development of the process. The tack that we're taking is much more collaborative, saying to the regulators and stakeholders and people who are going to be questioning any permits or variations that we're putting in, saying, look, this is what we're trying to achieve and this is what we're measuring. And so it is lengthening the permitting and development timeframes on the early stage, but it is also delivering a very robust result where people are in the process early enough to identify some of the key risks and engage, in a transparent way around them. So I think that when you start taking some of those pieces, and again, a little bit with what Alexander was saying around transparency, telling people what you're doing. The mining industry doesn't do a great job of letting out some of the data that doesn't really present commercial threat. It's just data that they haven't typically shared. So, transparency is an issue for us. Collaboration, community and stakeholder engagement is a big area for us that ultimately end up creating opportunity.
We had a question sent before the webinar asking about the tailings review. Aidan, perhaps can you give us an update on the ICMM UNEP PRI convened global tailings review? A bit about what stage are they at, any initial findings, and what are the next steps?
Sure, Andrew. Happy to give a little bit of an overview. And just as a reminder, the scope of that review really extends to three main areas, and that includes the development of a consequence-based classification system for tailings storage facilities in the first instance. Secondly, depending upon those various levels of classification, that we specify requirements around emergency planning and preparedness. And thirdly, requirements around credible and independent oversight. And so, as you mentioned, this is being done through a co-convened arrangement between ourselves, UNEP, and the Principles for Responsible Investment. And I'm delighted that Adam Mathews is also on this call because he's one of the nominated representatives of PRI as part of this process. I guess in terms of, you could think of the timeline on this. We came to agreement around that co-convened model in around mid to late March of this year. We swiftly moved as co-conveners to appoint a chair to oversee the Global Tailings Review, and that's Dr. Bruno Berle, who has now been in post for a number of months and is moving swiftly to deliver the work within the agreed timeframe, which I'll come to in a moment. A third thing that we collectively have done as co-conveners is to establish a multi-stakeholder advisory group, very much with a view to giving independent perspectives from multiple angles to both the chair in his oversight and conduct of the review, and the expert panel, which he has appointed to support him in that endeavor. And I guess that's the other major milestone. that we passed, in that in late May, early June, the expert panelists that will support the chair were finalized, and they include very experienced professionals from a range of disciplines, which naturally includes tailings storage facility experts, but also expertise in the area of social performance, environmental performance, health, safety, organizational change, etc. So those are some, I guess, of the major milestones that have been passed. They are now, they being the chair and the expert panel, are in an intense period of both research but also writing. So as part of that work, they are having reached to an extensive range of resources that are already out there. They are not starting from scratch or with a blank slate here. There's some incredibly good systems in place in different geographies around the world. There's some very good practice in this area. But what they are looking to do is to cast, I guess, a cold, critical eye across all of that, probably seek to select the best from that, and enrich it as they see appropriate to cover the scope of what is required under the terms of the international standard. And then finally, they are also looking to develop a set of recommendations that will support implementation of the standard once it is indeed approved. All of this is on a fairly short time frame, in that the expectation is the panel will conclude their work with the chair with a view to releasing the standard in a final form and the supporting recommendations report in early 2020, and that would be at the very beginning of 2020. So lots of work to be done. It's a very intense period of engagement between the chair, the expert panel, and the advisory group. I don't have privileged insight in terms of where they're at on all of that, but the co-conveners will be meeting with the chair and the advisory group towards the back end of August, where we expect to get a comprehensive update on progress.
We've had a number of questions submitted online surrounding Brumadinho. So first a question for yourself, Adam. I think it was recently Mark Bristow, now CEO of Barrick, said, "I'm paranoid about tailings dams." Is he right in his concern? And what steps can be taken to win back public trust post Brumadinho?
Well, is he right in his concern? I think absolutely. I mean, tailings dams are collapsing, and it's a trajectory that's deeply concerning, both to wider society, but also to those that are invested in the companies. And I also believe to the companies and those that work in the sector. I mean, nobody wants to see what has happened continue to happen. It's deeply concerning that we're sort of still at the point of having to sort of deal with this issue, when obviously there's been previous failings that one would have hoped would have led to the kind of changes that we're now going to see happen as a result of Brumadinho. So investors that have come together around the Mining and Tailings Safety Initiative, which is an investor initiative really in response to Brumadinho, have come together because of a deep concern that we've all got that this issue needs the focus and attention of investors at a very considerable level. We've convened investors 4 times in London now, and there's 105 representing over $12 trillion in assets under management that are regularly meeting and speaking. And equally, we're talking with the banking sector and the insurance sector around the kind of expectations we've had. Obviously, I'm representative from the investor group into the formal review that's developing the new standard for ICMM and UNEP, and that's absolutely a critical part of it. But quite frankly, my sense of it is that tailings have been treated as an externality, and whether, regardless of the rights and the wrongs of that seems to be how they've been treated in many instances. We do acknowledge that there's good practice in the sector, and we do acknowledge that some companies are operating to standards that are very high in relation to tailings monitoring and management. But at the same time, there seems to be a sort of real systemic issue here. So we feel that we're very much still at the beginning of unpicking this issue as investors and really fully understanding it. Simply put, Brumadinho shouldn't have happened. We'll have the formal reasons for why it did happen in due course through obviously all the legal proceedings going on. But as a sector, I think this will trigger a number of responses, not only the development of new standards, but I think there's going to be very clear expectations from investors around those standards being implemented, but equally that this remains absolutely atop of a CEO and a chair's agenda if they're going to retain the confidence of their investors. But I would also expect that you're going to see an alignment between the banking, the insurance and the investor community around this, because we do not want to be in a position again where this kind of event has happened and that there's a need for the kind of interventions that investors are making. But as I said, I still feel we're at the beginning of this. I still feel we're just getting an understanding of what the potential costs are. It's clear there's going to be certain categories or certain types of tailings facilities that are no longer going to be viable in certain conditions around the world, and how are we going to deal with that legacy issue, as well as ensure that future tailings facilities or mines have the highest standards. I think you'll see certain expectations around that emerge as well. Yeah, it's right for a CEO, a chair, to have that level of expectation that this is an issue that they've got to put considerable attention to. And I think that's going to continue with investors sort of expecting that as well. We deliberately wrote to the chairs and CEOs of 650 companies because we wanted them to respond, and many companies have, although not all. And we're now engaging quite intensely with those that haven't, because we need the level of disclosures that we're asking on this issue.
Elaine, when we spoke beforehand, you stressed the need for mining companies to not think about ESG from how they can just comply with ESG and meet the minimum expectations, but go beyond this to deliver on shareholder expectations. Can you expand a little bit on this?
Certainly, Andrew. Thank you. What I meant to say was that the concept that we talk about today as ESG is really derived from an investor concept for judging investment risk. And it's applied in quite a wide-ranging fashion with different organizations and different entities applying different criteria. And when I think about compliance is with regard to a legal or a regulatory requirement. And what I think is really important is for companies to think beyond doing the minimum. If companies are only doing the minimum, complying with regulations that are currently applicable, they're not going to be positioning their organizations well to address risks that are emerging, risks that are externally imposed that may be coming down the pike, and that doesn't serve their stakeholders, including their shareholders, in the best possible way. Regulatory requirements quite often lag the science. What we understand, what we know, is required to be protective, and often lags what society's expectations are for us as organizations. And we need to do more of looking outside ourselves, as has already been mentioned, doing stakeholder engagement in a more intense and deeper way. An example of this would be how a company thinks about water and how they manage water. If they only focus on minimum discharge requirements and don't take a more holistic view of how they fit into the catchment where they operate, what are the requirements of other entities, whether that's communities or the ecosystem or other industry in that catchment, what does the future look like and what are the demands going to be? Then they're not really going to be positioning their operation or their company for that stability that's so important to us, operational stability, or the flexibility to grow, have optionality in the future. So that's what I was trying to convey with a beyond compliance mindset that I think is applicable to smaller and medium-sized companies as well as large companies when it's about a mindset as much as it is about throwing resources at something.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for that. I think that this leads on to our second poll of the webinar. And the question is, and we can get the polling question up now, is are investors pushing hard enough for miners to implement ESG? And once again, you have three choices, yes, no, or unsure. And whilst I'm asking you to go and send in your votes, perhaps I can just turn the question over to yourself, Adam. What's your view? Are investors pushing hard enough for miners to implement ESG?
I'd probably answer no and qualify it saying that some are. I think some asset owners are really starting to get into the level of detail and expectation and building the kind of groupings that sort of detail that. I think if you look at the tailings issue, investors, for example, I mean, tailings for me is the perfect example of an ESG failure, and it's something that investors engaged with post the Samarco disaster 4 years ago, where 19 people were killed and considerable environmental damage. Investors engaged very much with the companies rather than with the sector in the response there. And I think we've all learnt a very clear lesson that actually there's a number of issues within the sector that need to be dealt with more at a sort of systemic level than necessarily simply through our engagement with individual companies. I think that will be a key feature of some of the discussions taking place amongst the PRI conference, Principles Responsible Investment, and the Responsible Investment community in September in Paris, where there is a sort of recognition that we need to be much more actively involved, and I think the tailings issue is leading people to that. But you're seeing a massive trend on ESG growing, and it's all going in one direction. And I think the last speaker said about tick boxing is actually right. If you approach this from a tick box perspective, that's really not what we're after. It's much more significant and deeper than that, and I think people will align investments accordingly on this. But I think we're as much on a journey with this as well. So my sense is that the Brumadinho disaster has been the wake-up call to a much more detailed, deeper relationship with investors that want to remain invested in the sector. My fear is that people walk away from the sector, which for me is the wrong response, because we need this sector to succeed and flourish. Disasters like Brumadinho challenge people because it's easy to walk away from it. It's relatively small when you compare it across your whole portfolio if you're globally invested. And that for me would be a real disaster.
Thank you very much for that. So I think we can now bring up the results of the second poll. And the audience, you voted, 17% of you voted yes, 17% of you voted unsure, but 67% of you voted no to the question of are investors pushing hard enough for miners to implement ESG. So let's now turn our attention to how investors in the industry are responding. And firstly, turning to yourself, Elaine, how have Newmont's ESG policies been received by the investment community?
Our investors largely understand that Newmont Gold Corp, from the CEO on down, take our ESG policy and performance very seriously. We see it as an important business enabler, and we start all of our meetings with a discussion at a minimum on safety, whether that's of the topic of the meeting or not. Our investors understand that our approach to ESG matters and our results help us lower our risk of operational disruption, increase our optionality for growth in terms of our social license, and increase our ability to recruit and retain the brightest and the best workforce. That said, we don't get a lot of questions from investors on environmental and social matters. We do get more questions on governance. What I believe is that because in our case, we've received quite a bit of external recognition for solid performance supported by good policies, including being the industry leader on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index for 4 years in a row, that provides some level of assurance that we are in fact managing our ESG threats and risks in a confident and well-managed way.
Alex, how are investors moving towards adopting a holistic ESG mindset in their investment process?
Yeah, I really like that word holistic. It's apt. You know, kind of the interdependence of all these parts is really critical. You know, Andrew, you and I communicated a bit on the subject of the dollar context within the investment industry. And actually, I think it's important to highlight some aspect of that here because it really grounds the discussion in a way. So, you know, the universe of dedicated ESG funds is about 2,500 or so. And these are ones obviously with an explicit ESG investment mandate. And the AUM is still quite small, relatively speaking, around 720 billion. And, you know, the Global Sustainability Investment Alliance survey quotes about 31 trillion in global ESG assets. And that's obviously using a very liberal definition of the firms that supposedly incorporate ESG factors. There are analysts that are skeptical. You know, JP Morgan thinks the number's inflated by a factor of 10. So about 3 trillion or so. I think we're pretty aligned with that as well. But really the important point is that that range between, let's say, 3 trillion and 30 trillion is simply reflects kind of this adoption or, you know, awareness continuum that I mentioned previously, you know, with reluctant folks that just beginning to edge in at one end and the more progressive ones on the other. And I'd say the point for our audience is less about an absolute AUM number and more about ESG integration trends, which is not a fad and to my mind is going to continue until all these factors we've discussed a little bit here, you get fully incorporated into normal, I forgot this isn't video, people can't see I'm using air quotes here, normal investment analysis by virtually, you know, all investors. So we might get to a point 10 to 20 years from now where people are like, of course we look at all this stuff, it just makes sense. So the ESG integration effort really is the more broad-based movement that's going to affect how mining analysts interact with mining execs and IR folks moving forward. So it's something that I think miners really need to gain insight to. I'd say on the sell side, and the public company miners are probably feeling this already. I'm sure Newmont is. You know, the industry is just beginning to kind of coalesce around the metrics that they feel really move the needle. So, you know, metric tons of greenhouse gas per 1 million US dollar sales revenue. You know, megawatt hours of energy consumed per 1 million US dollar sales revenue. You know, does the firm have a CO2 reduction policy? What's employee turnover look like? Female board representation, you know, et cetera. I'd say on the buy side picture, it's a bit more complicated. And the problem really boils down to no correlations, right? So unlike credit ratings on corporates and sovereigns, all the ESG ratings are all over the place. So many buy-side people are, you know, talking to MSCI and the Sustainalytics of the world, or they're like, well, what do we do with this? I mean, even on the sovereign side, you know, similarly rated sovereigns, so same credit risk, have pretty widely divergent ESG country ratings. So many on the buy side are pulling all this analysis in-house. And, you know, I think what a lot of investing folks don't realize is it's precisely that opportunity for investors right now. You know, once things are standardized, the information is going to be fully priced into securities around a consensus. So it's kind of funny when I hear investors saying, well, we're going to wait until all this gets more standardized. Really, you know, really what they're saying is, well, okay, we're going to wait until this becomes really hard to generate alpha with these data, right? So the kind of exciting thing is that that's a ways off and smart investors are using these data now.
Thank you for that. Matt, what are the key criteria that an ESG investor uses when evaluating whether to allocate to a mining company?
Well, I mean, to some degree, I actually, let me pick up on a couple of the comments that went by because they're pretty important and they're relevant to the question. So Adam talked about the risk of people walking away, and in general, the trend, you know, if you look at that GSIA report, it breaks down their different sustainable resource investment categories really into negative exclusionary, and then it moves on all the way through to active engagement and best in class. And the easiest thing to do is say, you know what, we're not going to invest in this because it just presents too much headline risk or risk that we can't understand and calibrate. And I think that picks up a little bit on what Alexander's saying, where as these standards do start to come in and people are agreeing these are things we're going to be measured on and those correlate to returns, you know, it may be that rather than people throwing up their hands and saying we're not going to invest in materials, that they may start to move cautiously back into the space. So these are hugely important trends for capital formation, for this, you know, the continued supply of pipelines and projects in a growing world, and we're seeing it particularly in the junior end of the sector. The lack of capital availability for emerging producers and developers is extreme. Now, from our standpoint, we probably follow, answering the question asked, we follow you know, a set of criteria where we look at health and safety, we look at you know, environmental, we look at country risk, and we are looking for indicators that in our experience investing in jurisdictions or in different mineralogies or in different situations are bringing up, you know, a certain set of negative indicators that will say, all right, that might just be too hard of a setup for us to begin to go. What I'm excited about, we're not all the way there. I think the whole field is evolving, but what I'm excited about is that as a firm, we're moving towards places that that are more like what Elaine is talking about, where you're changing the mindset of a company, where you're coming in and providing true alpha as a very concentrated, focused investor, and trying to change the, you know, the policies, starting with executive compensation and internal targets, and in fact, complete operating models. So mining, everybody on this call understands, is incredibly technical and detail oriented, and the regulatory interface can you know, double or triple the complexity. And so how you approach handling all of that complexity as a company is incredibly important. So again, starts at the top and materializes its way through. And what we're finding is that opportunity for alpha is real. You can change mindsets. You can start with a environmental compliance mindset instead, or not a checkbox compliance mindset, but an environmental performance mindset, which is much more of a positive rather than avoiding a negative outcome, and that ends up giving really different outcomes. So some of what we're doing as an active investor is not just looking at criteria, but actually looking for areas to make a change. And I think that the emergence of, you know, some of the standards that have been talked about is going to be helpful for the broader investment community, but also for the performance of the mid cap and junior sector as well.
Thank you very much for that. We've had a number of questions sent in by webinar participants about the various rating methodologies out there. So perhaps I can ask Aidan. Aidan, what rating methodologies and organizations are there out there that measure ESG performance?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I mean, look, you get some organizations out there like Bloomberg or Moody's that are much more in the business of providing raw ESG data that others use to provide ratings. And, you know, in terms of what's out there, there's lots of methodologies and organizations. Somebody mentioned MSCI earlier. You've got organizations like Sustainalytics, Vigeo Eiris, etc. So I would say that there's no shortage of providers, but I'd echo what Alex Shea said a little bit earlier, that, you know, ESG ratings are all over the place. We don't see any kind of consistency in approach or convergence. And so, for example, one specific challenge I think that some of the approaches adopted by some of the rating agencies is a very heavy reliance on what they refer to as controversies, which, you know, in and of itself is somewhat controversial, I know, with some people who watch this space closely, on the basis that some of these controversies have an incredibly long shelf life and never quite seem to retire out of corporate history. And that's not to say that you should ever forget your history, but there does come a point at where it may be much less material to the organization as it is many years and sometimes decades later. Having said that, I think increasingly, the more sophisticated investors have their own in-house capacity, and Church of England, for example, is a prime example of this. And while most of those more sophisticated investors will tell you that they subscribe to at least one of the rating agencies, they often say in the same breath that we place limited weight on them, or we use them, draw upon them quite selectively. So it is a bit of a mixed bag at present, I think.
Okay, and just a follow-up, I think probably for yourself, Aidan, this is a question again sent in by one of our webinar participants. Looking at the KPIs reported under GRI for mining, there are none that seem to verify board assurance of technical and operational risks. Boards are dominated by commerce, law and accounting professionals. How can we improve representation of mining deep domain experts on mining boards to ensure that the right questions are asked at the right time?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. And I think, it's interesting that you should raise the question of the extent to which GRI covers off in that specific aspects. And I think it is to a limited degree. But in terms of how do you ensure that you get the right level of board representation that can ask those probing questions, increasingly we are seeing across our member companies that you have both at the exco level somebody of the heft and caliber of Elaine Dorward-King in the case of Newmont, who has that level of representation at a very senior level within the company, but then crucially at the board level. Many of the company members of ICMM also have in place boards that are specifically focused on ESG factors. And so not always, but sometimes you will get a board level appointee who primarily has a deep knowledge and understanding of ESG related issues as well. That's certainly, I think, a trend that we're seeing taking place, and I think it's a very encouraging one. So that's not to say we are where we need to be as of yet, but we've seen some tremendous progress, I think, over the last decade in this space.
Okay. I think let's kind of bring up the last polling question. And the last polling question, if we can just bring it up on the screen now, it concerns on how seriously is ESG being taken by exploration companies, which are after all the lifeblood of the industry. This polling question, I have to say, was prompted by when I asked one exploration company as to how important ESG was, and their answer was, what does ESG stand for, which was slightly concerning. So getting the question up on the screen is, are exploration juniors taking ESG seriously? And if we can just bring the question up on the screen now, you should have 4 choices. Option 1 is very seriously. The second option is quite seriously. The third option is not seriously at all. And the fourth option is it doesn't matter because at the exploration level, it's all about the funding. Whilst we're polling the audience, perhaps I can turn to yourself, Matt. What's your view? Are exploration juniors taking ESG seriously?
Andrew, remind me never to get on the wrong side of a poll with you. That was a pretty funny lead-in to the poll. Anyways, I think it comes back to it comes back a little bit to the mindset and the issues that are there. The resources are obviously very tight. The smaller companies, pre-revenue companies that are chronically undercapitalized, they struggle to present some of these issues as being credible or meaningful, and some of that's mindset and old school thinking. What you find is that it's actually very impactful to do some very little things that are actually quite cost effective. I'll give you an example. At the moment, we're rolling out something actually that we picked up off of Newmont. which is an indigenous person onboarding module. So the contractors and drillers that are and wildlife baseline accumulators and all the people involved in this project development. We're developing a module that mirrors essentially the First Nations that are involved in one of our projects, and helps people understand what the cultural values of the First Nations are around the lands that are there. And that's something that I know that Newmont has done at other sites. When you think about what that does, that's actually just a real sign of respect and understanding that that these lands are important to the traditional owners and to the community. And it's not just traditional owners; it's people in the community, and understanding that you're on these lands and working them. And that sign of respect ultimately it goes two ways. You end up showing respect and receiving respect, and that helps build your social license and land access. And there are plenty of projects where land access at the exploration level is complex or held up. I'm not certain that something like what I just talked about is the silver bullet that gets you all the land access you need, but it's certainly a step in the right direction. And in terms of being cost effective, it's very cost effective. It's just a small amount of time in thinking about how are you running your business and who's involved in the creation of a project or a business. So there are little things that explorers can do, even if they feel like every dollar needs to go to drill bit, to make a more effective drill bit. And those are the types of programs that we're working on rolling out amongst our portfolio companies, and that we're looking for opportunities to do that in our future investments.
Thank you very much. I think if we can just get the answer for the polling up, 0% of you said very seriously, 32% quite seriously, 58% not seriously at all, and 11% it doesn't matter. I guess the only observation that I would make is, certainly as the conference organizer for Mines and Money, I certainly do see Exploration Junior's sentiment changing. And I'd like to think that if we were to ask this question in maybe a year or 2 years' time, it would have moved to, would have slightly more people saying very seriously or quite seriously, as opposed to not seriously at all. We just have time for a couple more questions from the floor. One question that was sent in, which I think is probably best for Elaine to answer. How can investors gain assurance that mining companies practice what they preach, given the past track record of the industry?
Thank you, Andrew. Well, I think there are a couple ways. One is by ensuring when you meet, when investors and their analysts meet with the executives of mining companies, is that they actually ask questions about how some of the substantive social, environmental, and governance risks are being addressed. As I said before, sometimes I think it's presumed that those things are being managed well, but if the questions aren't being asked and some interest isn't being shown, then it's hard to determine, and that also has an influence on how companies respond. The other way is to insist on adequate reporting and communication by companies of what they're actually doing. And I think the reporting has improved a lot, but there is still more that many companies can do to provide information and data at the operational level, at the mine site level, at the facility level, rather than just corporate aggregated information that makes it more difficult, I think, to answer specific questions about how risk is managed. So it's a combination of making sure that the information is available and is useful, and if not, providing the companies with feedback so they can improve. Most of us want to improve our communication, transparency, and reporting, and then following up policy with actual questions and engagement with the senior executives of companies.
And then just one final question from the, and then just one final question from the floor that I'm going to direct to Adam. If there was one thing that the mining industry could do differently to what it's currently doing, what is the one thing that you'd like the mining industry to do when it comes to changing the way it's approaching ESG and ESG issues?
Oh, recognizing that there isn't one way of dealing with this. So that's a flippant answer. I mean, I think this is a deeply complicated set of criteria that cuts across all aspects of a business. So I think one response is impossible, but taking this seriously, I think, is probably the overriding message. This is absolutely critical to the way that a growing and considerable percentage of investors are investing. It's only going to continue. It's not a trend. It's the way that investment will really be going, and people will increasingly be engaging, making investment decisions based upon the way that companies are profiled. I concur with some of the comments that Aidan made about some of the difficulties across different ratings, and I think you've got to continue to work with them, but equally work with investors. Ultimately, we want companies to succeed. We need to have companies succeed in a way that doesn't really do damage to our investors, but equally to our ability to have a world in which people can retire into. So hopefully we're partners, but I think you're going to increasingly see expectations. So engage fully with the ESG agenda.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think we've now run out of time, so a big thank you to Elaine, Adam, Alex, Aidan and Matt. Thank you to all of our listeners for dialing in. We'll be covering ESG in great detail at our upcoming Minds and Money London event on the 25th to the 27th of November, where the panelists you heard today will be presenting. There is a special webinar offer that I think is coming up on the screen now. It's registered with the code MMLWeb to claim your 15% discount. We also have another event running in Melbourne on the 29th of October to the 1st of November for our viewers who are based in Australia and Asia Pacific, which is our IMARC, International Mining and Resources Conference. I'd also encourage you to sign up and to go and attend that event as well. Last but no means least, all listeners of this broadcast will be entitled to a discount. All the listeners of this broadcast will also be invited to our next webinar, which is our webinar on copper, taking place on the 14th of August. And for more great news and content, please check out our Mining Beacon website at www.miningbeacon.com. Many thanks, and see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.